Good evening. And thanks for hanging out with me for a little while to talk about coming of age in Jim Crow, DC. So I'm Paula Austin. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University. I teach African American history and civil rights history. And I am very happy to be finally sharing the book with my ASALH family. The book came out in early 2020, and so I have not yet really had an opportunity to share it. And the book really comes out of an acknowledgement and recognition of a long history of young Black people's engagement in campaigns against anti-Black violence, even well beyond what many of us sort of conventionally think about as the civil rights movement. And of course, we know that that is not only because young Black people have a long history of being at risk of state harm and murder, but also as a result of a long history of adultification and criminalization, which is true for both Black boys and Black girls. So the book is about Depression era Washington, DC. And during that time, social scientists and reformers and media and police generally considered all, well, most if not all poor and working class young people at risk for juvenile delinquency, but young Black people, of course, had the added factor of Blackness that imposed on them a kind of essentialized criminality. And for the young people in the District of Columbia, this was really compounded by the violence of racial segregation in the period between World War I and World War II. So what I was trying to do was really sort of center both the vulnerabilities of young Black people and the ways that they were and are contemporarily thinkers and theorists, just really adeptly aware of the very dangerous and contradicting circumstances in which they lived in the nation's capital, and which of course at the time was sort of trying to position itself as the sort of Western seat of democracy. And so I was really interested in kind of how they're aware of it, how they are acting kind of to refuse these imposed conditions. So at the time that E. Franklin Frazier, and there he is at the bottom there, who is a sociologist at Howard University, of course, at the time that he was conducting the study that he was doing with young people in DC, many reformers and social scientists were kind of taking up, child science, children, adolescents, delinquency as not just an area of national study, but also a place for policy advocacy. But what really comes through in the interviews that Frazier conducted, and he conducted, he was part of this group of social scientists that you see here who all published books at about the same time, who were all doing research on young Black people. And he was of course focused on DC and Louisville, Kentucky, and he did a little bit of research in New York. But so at the time that he was doing the interviews, and there were about 200 of them, the young people that he was interviewing, what really comes through in those interviews are the ways that young people were not only physically navigating the district's racial segregation and Jim Crow, but also the ways that they were sort of thinking about the contradictions of the city and thinking about their own identities, their future, given the realities of the time in which they were living. So what I wanted to do for a little bit was just share one kind of tidbit from one of the interviews that actually one of Frazier's research assistants did. Laura Lee was a 21-year-old college student. Her parents lived in Northwest, and she was sort of back in the city and worked on this research project while she was there. And she spent a lot of time with a young person who was 14 years old, a girl who lived in Clark's Court Alley, which was kind of at the north part of Southwest DC, sort of where Museum Row is now. And so Laura Lee spent about 2 years interviewing this young person. And one of the questions that all of the young people were asked was whether or not they interacted with the police. And it's an important question because the summer of 1938, when this young person was being interviewed, that summer was a summer of protests, plural. And one of those protests was an anti-police brutality campaign that included a march and a rally of over 2,000 people, a petition drive that collecting signatures to get to President Roosevelt so that he could encourage Congress to do an investigation. And there'd kind of been some activism around trying to get Congress to do an investigation. So the question was an important one. And the young person that was being interviewed responded with a very affirmative yes. She did interact with the police, and she said, the police, they get after us a lot, but we so tight they can't get us. And so then she recounts an afternoon of swimming in the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. And that was an important place to cool off in the hot DC summer, because there was only one public swimming pool in DC for Black people. It was in Northwest, and Susie lived in Southwest. Her name was Susie Morgan. And the reflecting pool and the Union Station Columbus Fountain are sort of two of these places where young people could cool off. And so she tells this story, and of course there's evidence of young white boys frolicking and sailing boats in the reflecting pool, but she recounts an experience with a patrolman where she and her friends are trying to swim and just kind of chill out in the reflecting pool, and they get chased out. But before they're chased out, they're sort of threatened with bodily harm, and they sort of evade the patrolman. They go to the middle of the pool so that they can't get caught. They sort of mock the cop who's trying to get them out and threatening them, saying to him that he has to catch them in order to do bodily harm to them. And then they invoke Lincoln, and they point to him. They say he's given them express permission to be in the space. One of the kids in Susie's group actually pretends to speak as Lincoln. And it's this really interesting, and eventually the exasperated cop leaves to go get help, and then they crawl out and they run out. But what really struck me was that it was unlikely that this young person or any of the kids who were hanging out kind of knows about the problematic history of the Lincoln Memorial dedication in 1922, of its segregation and of prominent Black citizens being made to kind of cross a muddy path to get to the podium to speak. So despite not knowing that, the sort of political theater that this young person and her friends do to really negotiate and ultimately avoid police harm was really interesting to me. Now, I will shamefully admit that when I first saw this interview, they were all anonymized, that I assumed this was a boy speaking, and then I finally found the key, and so I was able to see who was telling this story and to learn a little bit more about her. And her interview is actually one of the kind of thickest interviews at Moreland Spingarn in the Fraser Papers. And so I was just really impressed by the kind of her ability to not only identify for the interviewer kind of the intricacies of reclaiming these spaces, this space as a leisure space, as kind of a protest space, and the political theater that she and her friends used to kind of counter segregation, and state-sanctioned terror, because one of the things that she and other young people talk about is fear, and is moving around the city and kind of managing the fear and the distress that they're experiencing. And this is just an image from the time of young people at the Union Station fountain, and some of the language that the young people use talking about sort of police surveillance, their interaction with the police. And finally, I'll just say a little bit about the protest that happens that summer and show you these two images on the left are images, newspaper images from the rally that happened in June 1938. And so it's clear that there are a number of Black young people, Black kids who are engaged in the protest. They're at the top photo is them flanking the car that's carrying the widow of the latest victim of the Metropolitan Police Department's thugs in uniform, which is what activists were calling them. The one on the bottom are some young people with some signage. Of course, that image on the bottom is I think Khalil Muhammad's new cover for his new Condemnation of Blackness book. And so I wanted to, I will stop there, but I think my main point in putting this research together was to get to the heart of some of the ways that young people, what were some of the things that young people were doing to kind of not just sort of manage, but to really kind of refuse some of the confines that were put in their place. And so the political activism is definitely one of them, but other things included, social activities with friends, leisure activities, games and sports. A lot of young people were doing art, sculpture, poetry, woodworking, playing music. There was one kid who was building a soapbox derby car for a local race, and all of them were making plans for their futures, both education, higher education, but also employment plans. And so really working to kind of mitigate and intervene in the violence and harm that was caused not just by the police, but also by economic discrimination, housing and food insecurity, and educational and healthcare inequities. And so I will stop there, and I welcome a conversation. So thank you. So I don't know if folks have questions or comments, or if anyone has gotten a chance to look at it, or maybe you've heard the Susie Morgan story before. I will also put in the chat there's a discount code for to order it through the press. So I'll put the link for the press NYU Press in there. I can add that, one of the backdrops for writing it was really the Michael Brown's murder. And when I was first working on it, and it became really clear to me, especially some of the descriptions of Michael Brown and sort of why he was killed, really made it clear to me that we sort of have legacies of not thinking about, and I think, the police and media and even some, policy folks are left with kind of the vestiges of thinking about Black young people, and especially urban, poor and working class Black young people in particular ways. So not just kind of adultified or criminalized, or in the case of Michael Brown, sort of superhuman or not human, but also not as people who are intellectuals and who are crafting analytical frameworks and kind of figuring out, how to deal with some of the contexts of their lives, and also kind of how they're thinking about themselves going into the future, kind of despite the realities that they're living in. And I think that was the thing that came through so clearly to me from these interviews that were done by Fraser, who was not in, he wasn't doing the interview to get to that kind of information, and he doesn't really use any of that kind of information in the book that he publishes. But that was the kind of thing that really came through, and it made me think that we might have some of those kinds of sources. We might be making some of those kinds of sources right now that that we could think about in slightly different ways, and that certainly that historians will be able to use in the future. So I think that's our time. If anyone has any questions or thoughts. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me a little bit. Here is my email. Thanks, everyone.